Former advertising copyist and TV writer John Flanagan fulfilled his dream of writing novels when he published The Ruins of Gorlan, the first book in the medieval fantasy series Ranger's Apprentice. Based on stories Flanagan would tell his son, Ranger's Apprentice is about, as you might expect from the title, the apprentice of a ranger. In this universe, rangers are like ye old secret police for the king of a place called Erak, which is basically just medieval England. The rangers, unlike everyone else in the 50 fiefdoms of Erak, don't have to answer to the local baron and can freely operate in his territory, but they assist the baron as they are able. The core of the story is the relationship between orphan boy Will and his master Halt, a grizzled old ranger who teaches Will how to do a stealth archer build. At the start of the first book, Will and his fellow orphans Horace, Alice, Jenny, and George are dreaming of being accepted as apprentices by the various craftsmen who work for the local baron, Baron Arld. Will's friends are all natural picks for battle school, the diplomatic service, the kitchen, and scribal work, respectively. But although Will wants to become a soldier, he's not really cut out for battle school since he's sneaky and small. After Will is rejected by all the other craftsmen, Halt sets up a secret test for Will, which proves to the Baron that Will would make a good ranger. Will's not too into the idea of becoming a ranger's apprentice because everybody thinks the rangers are wizards who practice black magic, but it's this or go work as a farmhand for the rest of his life, so Will gives it a shot. Although Halt is coarse and difficult, Will soon finds that being a ranger's apprentice is much more interesting than he thought, and that the training he receives from Halt complements his own natural skill. It also becomes clear that Halt is like the MVP of rangers, and he's just pretty humble about it. While Will has an unexpectedly good time learning to use a bow, the specialized knives employed by rangers, and his special gray-green cloak for camouflage, Will's fellow orphan Horace, meanwhile, is having a rotten time at battle school. Although Horace is a natural soldier, he finds himself bullied by the other boys, and when the orphan kids meet up to share how their apprenticeships are going, Horace takes his anger out on Will and their relationship sours, particularly once Horace tries to ride Will's special ranger horse, who can only be ridden using special ranger code words, and causing Horace to embarrass himself. But the boys work it out once Will has the opportunity to save Horace from a wild boar, which inadvertently leads to a confrontation with Horace's bullies, neatly solving that problem as well. Next, Will and Halt go to the annual Rangers gathering where the spies swap notes, and Will has a chance to meet Gillen, Halt's apprentice before Will. From Gillen, who's a former aristocrat, Will realizes that not everyone picks being a ranger as a backup profession like him, and that being a ranger is a great honor. Although Ranger's Apprentice is technically a fantasy book, the supernatural is used very, very rarely, particularly after the first couple books. Our first big bad is Lord Morgareth, who controls an army of monsters called the Wargles with telepathy, and 2 hypnosis gorilla guys called Kalkara. In addition to his monsters, Lord Morgareth has also been enlisting the help of the Skandians, and the Skandians are literally just Vikings, but we don't call them that. After the first book, John Flanagan will fully indulge his desire to flex his dad who reads too many history books muscles, and the series essentially just becomes historical fiction taking place in medieval Europe, but with the country names switched around to keep things interesting. I thought this was super lazy as a kid who was more into traditional fantasy, but now I appreciate Flanagan's attention to detail and the authenticity that comes from sticking to technology and culture from the real world. Lord Morgareth is using his Kalkara as assassins to hunt down people who helped defeat him the last time he tried the world domination thing, and that includes Halt and the king of Erak named Duncan. In a showdown with a Kalkara, Will makes an expert shot with a flaming arrow to burn the highly flammable creature, saving his master. After partying with his friends and kissing Alice, the Baron offers Will the chance to fulfill his life's ambition and become a soldier, but naturally Will declines since being a ranger is cool. And a proud Halt gives Will his bronze Oakleaves, which are the mark of a real official trainee ranger. In the Burning Bridge, Morgareth is still being a pain, but Halt and Will find his battle plans, allowing King Duncan to start deploying troops. Duncan is also trying to secure aid from the neighboring king of Celtica. Because it's a pretty low difficulty mission, the Rangers choose the young Gillen as an emissary, but the people of Celtica are superstitious about the number 3 being lucky, so Gillen needs 2 other basically inconsequential people to go with him, namely Will and Horace. As former nobility, Gillen is the only ranger to use a sword instead of the standard twin knives, so along the journey, he gives Horace fencing lessons and lore dumps about how cool Halt is. Meanwhile, the Halt in question is extra grumbly with his apprentice gone, and is throwing knights into moats. So Baron Arld sends him on a mission to make a lord give the Baron some troops he's supposed to, and the diplomat Lady Paulina sends her bubbly apprentice, the aforementioned Alice, along with Halt to keep him company. It's basically an open secret that Lady Paulina and Halt are dating, which Alice teases Halt about along the way. The plan to keep Halt out of trouble doesn't exactly pan out, and when the Lord insults Lady Paulina, Halt throws him into a moat too. In Celtica, the trio find that Morgareth has already attacked their ally, and the first town they come across is deserted. After dealing with some bandits, they run into a girl who identifies herself as Evelyn and says that she's a maid for a noble from Erak, but that her party were all killed. Gillen and Will immediately think Evelyn's story is baloney, and she's probably the noble herself and not just a noble's maid, but they decide to be cool about it and not say anything. Gillen realizes the whole mission is kind of pointless with Celtica having already fallen, so he decides to make a beeline for King Duncan to warn him, leaving Will in charge of getting everyone home safely. But Will is diverted when he discovers that the battle plans found at the start of the book are super made up, and Morgareth is planning to invade Eriluen by forcing the Celts to build him a bridge, which will allow him to lead a combined invasion of Wargals and Skandian mercenaries, so the trio decide to burn the titular bridge. Meanwhile, Gillen makes it to the king's war council, telling him about the fall of Celtica. The king is alarmed when he hears the story about Evenlyn, because the noble who was traveling was his daughter Cassandra, meaning his daughter is dead. But based on the king's description of his daughter, Gillen is able to confirm his theory that Evenlyn is Cassandra in disguise. In Celtica, things go south fast when the plan to burn the bridge results in the Skandians capturing both Will and Evenlyn, though Horus escapes to fill everyone in on what happened. Erak, the Jarl of this particular party of Skandians, is not that bad a dude from a Viking perspective, and he keeps Morgareth from getting his hands on Will and Evenlyn. And lucky for Evenlyn, her cover story prevents the Skandians from finding out that she's the king's daughter, but unluckily the Skandians are slavers, and the burning bridge is about to end on a cliffhanger. No pun intended. Morgareth's forces get whooped by King Duncan's now that most of them couldn't get across the bridge, and Morgareth tries to goad Halt into single combat, but Horus challenges Morgareth instead and defeats him, breaking Morgareth's hold on the Wargals. In the Icebound Land, Halt is once again irritated, this time because the Ranger Order won't let him abscond to Skandia and go save Will, so Halt intentionally gets himself banished from Eriluen by publicly insulting the king in a crowded pub. But King Duncan is a nice guy, so he banishes Halt for 1 year, which is functionally the same thing as giving Halt a sabbatical so he can go save Will. It's difficult to communicate in a summary like this, which is why you should just read the books if you haven't already, but these characters are unexpectedly funny, particularly the kings and lords, and their dialogue to each other, while maybe not entirely medieval status quo, is nonetheless quite entertaining. Horus decides to join Halt on his exile to go rescue Will. Horus and Halt journey towards Skandia by way of the country of Gallica, which is lawless and sucky compared to Eriluen, and as they take out various bandits, Horus adopts the name Sir Horus of the Oakleaf. All the bandits Horus takes out result in their being captured by the bandit leader and taken to his castle, but Halt just shoots the guy, which takes care of that. Cassandra/Evenlyn, meanwhile, thinks that once Erak brings her to Skandia, she can just announce who she is and convince the Skandian king, the Ober-Jarl Ragnik, to ransom her and Will. Unfortunately for our heroes, and fortunately for the plot, the Ober-Jarl has sworn some kind of Skandian blood oath that he will kill King Duncan or any of his family, which Ragnik did because his son was killed during the events of the Burning Bridge, so Evenlyn rapidly switches gears and keeps quiet. Once in Skandia, Erak swaps notes with the Ober-Jarl's second-in-command Borsa, who talks about the need for Skandian tacticians, people like the Rangers, which will be important later. Erak then sells Will and Evenlyn as slaves to the Ober-Jarl's household, where Will is sentenced to hard labor, and they give him an addictive drug called wormweed to make him work harder, which gradually causes him to lose all memory of himself or who he was. Erak feels bad about Will, so he helps Evenlyn escape with Will in tow, giving her some wormweed to gradually wean Will off of it so he doesn't die from withdrawal. While the pair live in a cabin in the wilds, Evenlyn tries to shoot food with a bow, but she sucks at it. Luckily, Will eventually recovers, but with no memory of the time while he was addicted to wormweed. The next book is called Oakleaf Bearers in Australia, but in the US we wanted something more hardcore, so it's published as The Battle for Skandia. This book picks up right where the last one left off and finishes up the mini-trilogy of Skandia stories within the larger series. As the story begins, Halt and Horus enter Skandia, but find that an invading army called the Temujai are infiltrating the country, which I'm pretty sure are basically supposed to be this world's equivalent of the armies of Attila the Hun. A Temujai scouting party abducts Evenlyn, and Will goes off to rescue her, just in time to reunite with Halt and Horus and swap adventures. Halt is concerned about the presence of the Temujai because 20 years ago, they almost conquered the Western nations, stopping their advance only because of internal politics. If Halt does nothing, the Temujai will be able to conquer Skandia, leaving the way open to attack Eriluen. The group meets up with Erak, who is in the middle of reluctantly serving as the Viking IRS, and they become begrudging allies, with Halt deciding to serve as a tactician to help the Skandians repel the invaders, for the good of Eriluen. The Ober-Jarl agrees to let Halt help, and everybody decides to be cool about the escaped slaves. Ragnak is less angry about his son's death than he used to be, but his vow to kill all of King Duncan's family is still binding, so they discreetly do not tell him that Evenlyn is the king's daughter. Evenlyn, meanwhile, is growing attached to Horus, and Will is fairly jealous about it, since he grew close to her during the whole abduction and escape saga. Halt's strategy to fight the Temujai is to teach the Skandians about guerrilla warfare, which is not at all to their liking, because they're not big on sneaky attacks, preferring to simply run at the enemy and kill them. Even with this strategy, the Temujai still will be able to conquer Skandia, but Halt's plan is to make the Temujai invasion so costly that their army will realize that defeating the Skandians isn't worth the effort, because it won't leave them enough forces for later excursions. Will also has the idea of teaching the slaves very, very basic archery, and in exchange for their freedom, they learn to rather inaccurately shoot at the Temujai. Things are going pretty swimmingly until it's discovered that Evenlyn is really Cassandra, and Ragnak is obliged to kill her. But Halt points out that the Temujai might kill them all anyway, so why not just wait until after the big final battle to sort it all out? And everyone just goes along with that plan. Luckily, Ragnak dies in a blaze of glory during the battle, and his oath dies with him. The Temujai decide that the Skandians are too much of a pain in the butt to deal with, so they move on to some other country to fight them instead. Finally, predictably, our friendliest Skandian Erak becomes the new Oberjarl, and he fittingly sails everyone home on his ship, as well as establishing a treaty with Eraluin which forbids large-scale raiding. King Duncan also just gives up on the year-long banishment, which still has 3 weeks left, and he lets Halt come home early, and Halt is reinstated as a ranger, which honestly irks me a little, because I feel like there should have been more lasting consequences for Halt's little detour. Maybe if he had been like a mercenary or something for a few books. Meanwhile, Will's friendship with Cassandra sadly falls apart, because he's too self-conscious about being an orphan nobody, and that she's the future queen. Cassandra tries to repair their relationship by getting her dad to promote Will into a royal archery commander, but Will wants to stay a ranger, which bums out Cassandra. I'm enjoying going back through these books way too much, and I need to speed things up. 2007's Erak's Ransom was written after the next 2 books, but takes place before them, so I'm just going to ignore the publishing order in favor of chronological. Erak's Ransom is kind of a victory lap for the Apprentice parts of the story, as Will transitions into being a full-fledged ranger, as well as an opportunity for John Flanagan to write a story which shows people he watched Lawrence of Arabia. In this book, Halt is getting married to Lady Paulina. At Halt's wedding reception, attended by all the characters from the story so far, a Skandian shows up to ask for help because Erak has been captured by a guy called Celathine from Merida, but really the capture was orchestrated by a minority of disgruntled Skandians who don't like that Erak is making nice with the Eraluins. Cassandra goes to arrange the ransom of Erak from the Aridi, and the usual suspects travel with her, leaving Alice to jealously worry that Will and Cassandra will hit it off, which they do not because they're too busy avoiding death. This book offers an opportunity to help finish up both Cassandra's growth into her role as the intended queen, and Will to grow into the role of a full ranger. Will gets almost immediately lost on a side quest to find his horse, and Celathine switches to Team Eraluin after he's betrayed by the Skandians who hired him to capture Erak. Then bandits capture everybody, so Will stages a rescue and gets everyone the heck out of there before the bandits execute them all. And once they get back, Will is awarded the silver Oakleaf of a full ranger, replacing the bronze one worn by apprentices. Also, they finally give the now adult Will a last name, because he straight up didn't have one since he was an orphan. The Sorcerer in the north jumps ahead, and Will is on his first solo ranger assignment. Will gets assigned to Seacliff Fife in order to replace an old ranger who's retiring. The first thing Will does in his new fife is steal some guy's dog, but the guy sucks, so we're not very sad about it. Unlike in Will's home fife, the Baron and his battlemaster are pretty lax in disciplining their soldiers, which turns out quite badly when a party of Skandian pirates show up. But the now diplomatic Will is able to arrange a peaceful resolution. Shortly after, Will reunites with Alice, who brings him a secret mission. A temporary reassignment where Will goes undercover as a jungler, which is basically a bard, except harder to say. Will has inexplicably picked up the ability to expertly play the mandala between books, which he uses to write Weird Al-style songs making fun of Halt, which helps with his bard cover. Will and Alice are overheard by the owner of the dog which Will stole, a man named John Buttle, who was trying to get it back. So Will straight up gives the admittedly evil John Buttle as a slave to the Skandians, which the story casts as the merciful option because the alternative was to kill him for overhearing the secret mission. Will's mission is to go undercover and find out if there really is a sorcerer in the north, who may or may not be poisoning the local baron, hence the name of the book. In the north, Will visits Macindaw Castle, ruled by the ill Baron Siren, with his son Ormond left in charge, but Ormond's cousin Karen commands the respect of the populace. Will is joined in his undercover mission by Alice, who is posing as Lady Gwendolyn, and together they discover that the supposed sorcerer in the woods is generated with rudimentary projector technology by an old healer named Malcolm. Ormond, despite being unpopular, is actually the good guy, and Karen is trying to poison Ormond, as well as his father, to get them out of the way. Ormond deduces that Will is a ranger and asks for his help, and they make a getaway from Castle Macindaw. While they're away, Alice is discovered by John Buttle, who escaped the Skandians and got recruited by Karen's private militia. The next book, The Siege of Macindaw, continues our mini-adventure with Will trying to rescue Alice. Lucky for Will, the storm which allowed John Buttle to escape also drove the Skandians to Macindaw, allowing Will to employ their services in sacking Karen's castle. Also luckily, Halt has dispatched an incognito Horus to give Will a hand, but their communications were disrupted so nobody knows how bad things have gotten. Karen also is getting allies of his own, the Skadi from Picta, who are going to invade Eraluin. Will's forces will become even more outnumbered if the Skadi show up before he can take Macindaw Castle, so he enlists Malcolm to make more projections to distract the occupiers, and then Will and Horace climb the walls with the Skandians. Karen goes for a last-ditch effort to use this mind control stone thing to make Alice kill Will, but Will confesses his love for her, which breaks the spell, and Will saves the day. The next story opens at the latest Rangers gathering. By this point, Will is kind of a celebrity, both among the common folk and especially among new apprentice rangers, and the report of Will's ingenuity at retaking Castle Macindaw was distributed as continuing education material for the rest of the Rangers. So Ranger Commander Crowley decides to formalize what keeps working in all of these books, and turn Will, Horace, and Halt into a sort of Ranger Special Ops team to deal with problems. And lucky for Will, that means he's moving back to his hometown, where Alice still lives. Halt, meanwhile, is dealing with the resurgence of the cult of the Golden God, called the Outsiders, led by a guy called Tennyson who is stealing everybody's stuff. The Outsiders have effectively taken over the region of Clonmel, and it looks like Eraluin is next. Lucky for Halt, his twin brother is King Ferris of Clonmel, because sure, that might as well happen. Technically, this was hinted at all the way back in The Burning Bridge, when Halt randomly pretended to be royalty, but I'm not entirely convinced that Flanagan isn't making this up as he goes along. But if he is, he's pretty good at it. King Ferris tried to kill Halt a bunch of times when Halt was younger, so Halt gave up and let Ferris be king, even though Halt was older. Ferris hoped Halt was dead, but no dice. Now Halt is back, with Will and Horace, to try to support Ferris, so that Clonmel doesn't become even more bandit-infested. But Ferris won't help, because he's a coward, so they knock him out and Halt temporarily takes his place, while Horace fights two outsider champions in single combat. As is storytelling tradition, Horace gets poisoned by the other team, and in all the commotion afterward, Ferris is killed, but Halt quickly sorts things out by getting his sister's son Sean installed as the new king. The Kings of Clonmel is another two-parter, so the next book, Halt's Peril, finishes things up, in which the gang try to track down the escaping Tennyson and the last of the Outsiders. But things go awry when one of Tennyson's gang gets lucky and shoots Halt with a poison arrow, which kind of derails the entire quest as Will and Horace dash to Castle Macindaw so they can try to get Malcolm to help cure Halt. Unfortunately, there are two possible poisons with two possible antidotes, and the antidote for the wrong one will kill Halt. Luckily, the guy who shot Halt is dispatched to make sure to finish the job, so he reluctantly tells them which poison he used after Will just poisons him too. Then, after defeating Tennyson, Will and Halt head back home for a big feast. Really very little happens in this book for how long it is. The early books are all between 250 and 300 pages, and then Flanagan must have fired his editor because they start to grow closer to 400. The last mainline installment is The Emperor of Nihon-Ja, which is the Ranger's Apprentice book for weebs. But before we can get to Ranger's Apprentice Japan, we open in Ranger's Apprentice Italy, called Tuscana, where Will, Halt, and Alice are overseeing a treaty between Tuscana and Arida. Meanwhile, Horace is hanging out in Nihon-Ja, reconnecting with George, learning new sword-fighting techniques, and making friends with Emperor Shigeru. Shigeru is a reformer, and his tampering with the class system leads the Senshi warriors who served him to start a revolt, led by a Senshi called Arasaka. Horace decides to stay and fight for the Emperor, rather than cut his diplomatic visit short, so Cassandra gets Team Eraluin to go help him out. And Celathin comes too for some reason. The Skandians have basically become a hired international navy instead of pirates by this point, so a Skandian ship takes them to Fantasy Japan. On the way, Alice bickers with Cassandra because she's still worried Cassandra is into Will, and Halt is irritated about it, so he says the subtext out loud, and forces everybody to make peace. When they get to Nihon-Ja, Horace and Shigeru have teamed up with the Kokori peasants to oppose the Senshi. After reuniting with Horace, Will and Halt train the peasants, while Cassandra and Alice go on a mission to get more reinforcements from a Lord Namatsu. There's a big battle, and Shigeru agrees to step down as Emperor to stop the bloodshed, and Arasaka's army deserts him out of respect for the Emperor. Cassandra and Horace get engaged, which neatly ties up that love triangle, and Will and Alice are implied to do the same. And that's where I'm going to stop summarizing, because that's the end of the mainline series, even though I know Flanagan is still churning out more of these books all the time. I haven't read the next one because I've heard that the story immediately kills off Alice, and that prospect makes me way too sad to keep reading. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time.